Injuries and titrating nutrition. So generally when it comes to injury, where we're talking about, it usually occurs in one or two cases. Firstly, it's a repetitive strain issue, okay? Or secondly, it's something that's more acute. So the difference would be having a shoulder niggle that gets worse and worse and worse over time because there's some dysfunctional movement pattern, versus being on the football field and getting hit and doing an ACL or something like that, okay? Now, ultimately, when we're talking about, how would you titrate your nutrition based on your injury, what we really need to discover is like, how serious an injury is it, and how much is that really going to impact your overall day-to-day, okay? One of the big parts of what we do with MTMM is we really do encourage that education front with our clients, because we're trying to develop their ability to critically think, okay? And part of critically thinking on how you should adjust your nutrition based on your circumstance is understanding all the different factors and elements that go into determining what an appropriate amount of energy is for you at any given time, okay? And that's inherently one of the biggest challenges with nutrition, is generally it's always a moving target that we're trying to hit. Day to day, your activity is not going to be exactly the same as the day before or the day after. So for the most part, we're trying to work out a healthy average over the course of the week, whether you train 5 times, 3 times, whatever it is, okay? So the first thing you need to do when you are injured and you're contemplating how should I titrate my nutrition is, how serious an injury are we talking about? Is this just some tenderness that means 1 or 2 days of reduced intensity, or is this something that's got you in a cast, is keeping you incredibly immobile for long periods of time, or somewhere in between, okay? Personally, when it comes to injury management, the most perfect approach with me is, or that I would feel, is that you can always still do something. And we look at movement as this incredibly useful part of health. If you've done your shoulder or your knee or there's still always generally something that we can do, which is important. But definitely we're probably going to need to look to titrate, which means we're going to need to make an adjustment on that energy balance equation, right? So when we're talking about energy balance, we're talking about where your intake is relative to where your output is, okay? Now, when we talk about the things that go into making up your caloric input, we're talking about your BMR, your NEAT, your thermogenic effective feeding, and your resting metabolic rate. Now, if you've only got a minor injury, for the most part, exercise is really going to only make up 10 to 30% of the average person's total daily energy expenditure. So if the impediment of the injury is only minimal, how much really is that going to impact day to day? Okay. And even if the injury is quite substantial, it might only be affecting that real intentional exercise level of that part of the intake. So if it's only affecting one element of the total, the total pie that we like to draw during our seminars of the things that go into making an intake, you probably don't really need to bring down your intake so much or so drastically as what a lot of people will believe. Okay. Obviously, the inherent fear is without the exercise, I'm all of a sudden going to be tipped into caloric surplus and I'm going to add fat, right? In fact, a lot of the research shows when it comes to an acute injury that actually our energy requirement increases almost up to 25% in that first week. Okay. So if you think of inflammation, and recovery and repair, like how much effort that is for the body on something that's an acute injury where the response is directly trying to deal with that, it kind of makes sense that your requirements might actually increase in the short term, okay? Now, typically, that's not what we see. We don't generally see people have, whether it be a minor or a major injury, anything that's substantial enough to keep them out of the gym training in the way they would normally train. Generally, their first response is not to gently titrate down their TDE by 10%, right? Generally, we're going to see the exact opposite, where they're going to fall off the wagon. The break-in exercise is really going to throw their routine out of whack. If they're not training, they're a little on the depressed side, missing it. That's going to, potentially bring up some issues surrounding comfort eating, emotional eating, all that sort of stuff. All right. And then typically what we see is a decrease in activity with an increase in intake. Okay. And that's essentially where those negative elements of being out of energy balance occur.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I often find that with people when they do get injured, that's exactly what you see is they they feel like they aren't in control of their expenditure anymore in the gym, like what they can do, what their body is able to do in the gym, and they completely let go of all control that they do still have over their nutrition. They just kind of put it hand in hand, when really the amount of control that you have over your nutrition almost becomes even more important when you are injured and don't have that control over what your body can do in the gym.
100%. And, more so in a Globo gym context, but you always see people that are always in the gym day in, day out. And after a year or 2 years, body composition hasn't changed at all, right? And so that is a really good lead into, okay, well, there's obviously more than just the exercise element that goes into determining body type, body weight, right? So when we look at when we're injured, if all of a sudden we're in a state where our body is looking to repair and recover, the quality of the food that you're eating becomes more so paramount. Okay, it's not the time when you're trying to fight inflammation and repair muscle tissue damage to be eating a high processed food diet because you're a little bit upset that you can't 1RM your back squat or your strict press, right? So it is really the time to push all those really good vitamins and minerals, all those micronutrients that come from a really good array of fresh vegetables included into the diet, some really like healthy cuts of meat, like all that sort of stuff. That will make a big difference to the quality, and your ability to recover, and potentially the length of the injury as well, right? If you can get on top, remain positive, which is another big one, get some treatment, get some help, get some direction, get a plan in place that's going to facilitate coming back from injury, and you stay on your diet, you can probably turn what would either be 4, 5, or 6 weeks into potentially 3 or 4. Now, again, this is going to be dependent on the injury and et cetera, each judged by a recovery professional. But certainly you're not going to make the injury worse or exacerbate your recovery period by staying on a smart, healthy diet, right?
And it mentally, I think that it'll really help you put the effort that's required into your rehab and all that sort of thing when you are on point with your nutrition and you're spending that extra time that you would be in the gym, maybe on your meal prep, maybe on thinking of some like fun meal ideas or changing things up in the kitchen, like putting that time you would spend in the gym elsewhere that's still going somewhere that's going to better yourself and keep you heading towards your goals.
Exactly right. I mean, especially if we're talking about injuries that are caused by some sort of dysfunctional movement pattern or repetitive strain, it's like, well, what a great time to really work on your mobility and your meal prep, right? And like you said, if you can spend the 2 weeks that you don't have hours and hours in the gym into really like taking a 3-hour meal prep session and getting your processes down to a point where you can get it done in an hour and a half, like you're setting yourself up so by the time you can get back into the gym, you can get back in there and be better than you were when you hurt yourself, right? So I think like the probably the biggest takeaway from this one is that, okay, injuries are essentially like they're inevitable, okay? Especially for, when you're thinking about anyone that's competing relatively high level or with a relatively high level of intensity, you're going in day after day and you're essentially taking your body and you're saying, how hard can I push today? How heavy can I go? How fast can I go? How many reps can I get in? And when you flirt with that line, you are going to sometimes go too far and you're going to hurt yourself, right? It's just part of the game. And, some people would argue that if you're never getting to that point, you're either moving incredibly well or you're not really moving at a massively high intensity. That's fine. If your goals don't surround that, that's fine. More than okay. We're not saying that you have to always train with a paramount type of intensity, but what we are saying is when you do that regularly, you do flirt with that line. And there are sometimes, just like if you redline a car every day, eventually something's going to pop under the hood, right?
And making sure that you're set up for when that does happen and know how to manage it is extremely important so that you can get yourself out of that slump that typically people head it right into when they do get injured. It is depressing. It is hard to handle mentally, especially. So knowing what you need to do is really, really important.
Yeah. So definitely, I think to summarize, and it was a pretty long-winded explanation. We're getting close. But I think the danger is like be aware of how, pulling back on the training and increasing, the comfort eating is likely to put you into caloric surplus, right? Mm-hmm. Paramount, and we'll just do this quickly because I really want to keep this one brief, but the opposite is also true. We don't see it as often, but it does occur in which people think, all right, I'm not training, I need to drop the bottom out of my intake, okay? And I think that's going to be a topic that we do talk about soon, but there's just as many health issues that can stem from undereating as they can from overeating. And typically when we're dealing with new clients, it's much easier to work with clients who have a habit of overeating than undereating. All right. So definitely, we don't want you to drop the bottom out of your calories. We don't want you to blow the top off them. But what we're saying is we want you to think critically about how much of an impact the injury is having on your regular amount of activity and slightly titrate and adjust from there. And for anyone who is a client, if you hurt yourself in the gym, let your coach know so that we can do it for you. All right. How's that? Did you just make it?
Perfect. I think we just made it.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, Maggie.
Yeah, we'll see you next time.